Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Colborn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today my guest is Dr. Jack Hunter. Jack is an anthropologist exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He lives in the hills of mid Wales with his family. He's a tutor with the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology in Culture, University of Wales, Trinity St David. He is also a tutor with the Aleph Trust on their MSc in Consciousness, Spirituality and Transpersonal Psychology. His PhD at the University of Bristol took the form of an ethnographic study of contemporary trance and physical mediumship. He is also a musician and an ordained Dudist priest. In today's conversation, we discuss the anthropology of high strangeness experiences and why we need to take them seriously. Jack has himself experienced a number of strange things, including a vision in Bristol Spirit Lodge while he was researching his doctorate. We discussed how strange experiences might feed into and enrich consciousness studies, and how a rejection of animistic worldviews is connected to the exploitation of the earth. Jack, can you tell me a little bit how you became interested in the paranormal?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, I think it's something that I've always had a sort of an interest in, going right back to when I was a kid. Although I wasn't really sort of brought up to believe in the paranormal or anything like that, but I was also not really dissuaded away from it. And I was always interested in things like the Fortean Times and stuff like that. I had a few books around the house. There was Colin Wilson books, a big book that was like the A to Z of the paranormal or something like that. And 4 old copies of Fortean Times and things like that as well. So there was a few things around that I could sort of latch onto. And also Indiana Jones. I was really into Indiana Jones, and that's also partially why I ended up going into archaeology and anthropology as well. But there's also that sort of paranormal dimension to Indiana Jones as well. And I always found that kind of stuff interesting. And then as I was getting older, my best friend's older brother was really into Wicca, and he had a circle and all of this kind of stuff. And I was very interested in all of that. And, I went to talk to him, and I did a few sort of rituals and things myself as well, but never really was that kind of, fully embedded in it and didn't want to pursue it necessarily. But it was really interesting. And I noticed that there was, when you're doing rituals like that, a certain kind of atmosphere is kind of created. And it's just really magical. It feels magical. And that sort of feeling, I think, is something that I've been interested in sort of following and trying to find out what that magical feeling is all about when you get into a certain state of mind or practice and things suddenly feel different. So I have always had this awareness that, like, when people do practice magic and stuff like that, we might think of it as, delusional or whatever, or make believe or pretend. But actually, when you do those things, there are certain kinds of experiences and phenomena that seem to occur. So there was that, which was interesting. And then that kind of led into magic mushrooms. And my first magic mushroom experience was really obviously quite profound. We first experienced often are. But in this experience, I saw what I thought at the time were fairies, basically. And they were like a 2-dimensional goblin kind of looking creatures with long noses, pointed noses and pointy ears and things. But they were also very beautiful, and they had these sort of flowing robes on and stuff. And they were in the grain of wood of a chest of drawers. The drawer was kind of hanging out, and you see the side of the drawer, and they were going in a procession kind of along the side of this chest of drawers. And I sort of noticed them. I looked and saw them, and I went, "Oh my God, I can see fairies!" And they turned and looked at me. There was one at the front of the head of the procession, and looked at me, and they were kind of disinterested. Really, they weren't fussed. They clocked the fact that I'd seen them, but then they kind of carried on with their procession, and I must have lost interest and drifted off to look at something else then. But the interesting thing about it was that there was all of the psychedelic kind of stuff going on around it. Things changing shapes and distortions and fractally kinds of patterns and stuff. Then these guys were doing something. It was like they were deliberately doing this procession. They seemed to have their own direction and things like that. It was different to the impersonal kind of hallucinations. So, that was interesting to me as well. And I have been trying to think about ways that we can understand that kind of experience without having to reduce it down. And I'd say that, well, it was just a hallucination or something like that, because there are many ways that it could have been something more than that.
I mean, there's a couple of things to pick up there. I think the first thing is that sort of experience is actually surprisingly common, isn't it?
Mm.
I think there's a real fair. I think you've actually been on it. There's a Real Fairies podcast where the house seems to have found quite a lot of witnesses of quite similar, very strange things that have absolutely no place in the modern world. The second thing is, you made that. I'm presuming you're talking about when you were a teenager, but that means that you made the connection between sort of these very strange or weird experiences and consciousness, maybe altered states, very early. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. Because the first magic mushroom experience, I mean, that it showed that there was some alteration of consciousness was obvious. It was a very different way of perceiving the world. And when I was in that state, I saw these other things that, according to the mainstream dominant reality outside of the trip, can't possibly exist. But then when you're in the experience and it's happening to you, then they're there and seem to be doing something, even if it's kind of inconsequential. I mean, really, it's not a very deep kind of experience. There was no kind of interaction or communication or anything like that. It's just a sort of a passing glimpse of something. But I think that sometimes, altered states allow for that possibility, maybe, to catch a glimpse of something. There's also another interesting thing about, it's hard to think how changing your consciousness could kind of alter the world around us or make things visible and things like that. But I think there's something in consciousness and the world and reality kind of in some way being the same thing. So our consciousness is of the world, and when our consciousness is altered, the world is also altered in some way. The two things are the same.
So, I mean, I think what you're talking about is degrees of enchantment, really, isn't it? And personally speaking, I mean, I was a kid, I think I had a very naturally, a lot of children do, very animistic view of the world, that the world seemed and quite often seems very alive to me. Do you think there are degrees of intensity? Because I feel that I know exactly that atmosphere that you're talking about. And sometimes I feel that mildly just going into a wood, but there are times when it seems to become more intense. And that sort of intensity seems to be sort of correlated with how weird the experiences you have. I mean, I noticed in your writings, you mentioned Jenny Randall's, she's a British UFO researcher, and she coined this very good phrase, the Oz factor, because she noticed that a lot of the weirder UFO cases, like when people see entities, are often the prelude is this sense of a move of unreality or a move into a different state of consciousness.
Yeah, I think Jenny Randall's picked up on something interesting there. But, not the only person to have noticed this phenomenological change. And you can look back into the sort of history of religious experience research and things like that. And people have noted similar kinds of phenomenological characteristics. So Rudolf Otto is the classic example, really, with his idea of the numinous. And he said that there was this experience, he called it a feeling response, that occurs in human beings when they encounter something that is wholly other, or from another place or whatever. And this feeling response is kind of a consequence of encountering something other. And he said there are two strands to it. On the one hand, there's the mysterium tremendum, which is the fear and horror of seeing these kinds of things. And then on the other hand, there's the mysterium fascinans, which is the fascination that kind of draws us into it. And you see that kind of, if you talk to abductees or people who have had different kinds of paranormal experiences, this kind of feeling response seems to be there. They are frightened of it because it's so strange and other, but at the same time, you're kind of drawn into it, and it attracts you in. And I think in lots of ways, that numinous feeling response, the Oz factor, and also things like the feeling of the weird, defined as, the sort of uncanny experiences and things like that, they're all tapping into the same feeling responses that we have. And I think you're right that that is in some way related to the magical thinking or magical feeling that I was talking about before in rituals. Mm-hmm. But obviously these don't always happen in ritual situations, and sometimes they occur spontaneously, or there might be particular places in the environment that have, depending on how you want to think about it, maybe like a thinner barrier between worlds, or they might have some sorts of external like influences like infrasound and radiation or whatever that might affect us. But the same kinds of feelings and the same kinds of sensations and experiences occur kind of across the board with extraordinary experiences. Even, psychedelic experiences, paranormal experiences, spiritual and religious experiences. So I think it's something to focus in on.
Yes, I do too. I mean, let's put that to one side for the moment. We can come back to it a bit later. So you had these experiences as a kid and then as a teenager, and then obviously you moved into higher education, and you ended up doing was it anthropology, your degree, and then a doctorate. So can you tell me a little bit about that transition and how you managed that transition from having these very powerful and strange experiences, and then suddenly you come into the academy, which is very much a center of rationality, and things are a lot more buttoned down, aren't they? So how did you find that transition, and how did it affect your work?
Yeah, well, I think again, quite early on in high school, I realized that there was a place in the kind of academic subjects that we were studying to cover these things, and that was in RE lessons, religious studies. And I was really into religious studies because it was so fascinating to learn about other cultures, different beliefs about the world, talking about different creation stories and all of this kind of stuff in the RE lesson, which is usually seen as a DOS lesson or something that people don't want to get involved in. But, I loved it. And I wanted to do it for A-level, but I was the only person in the school who wanted to do it, so they didn't run the course. But I realized that there was something interesting in religious studies that kind of related to the things that I was interested in myself. And so when I came to looking for a degree to go into, I moved more towards anthropology rather than religious studies specifically, because it was a bit broader. And because obviously I liked Indiana Jones and stuff as well. So my first degree was archaeology and anthropology combined. And then as I was doing my undergraduate degree, I was really interested in sort of prehistoric archaeology and all of that kind of stuff. So most of my archaeology stuff was about the Neolithic and that kind of thing. But increasingly on the anthropology side, I was getting interested in the anthropology of religion. And mainly because of our lecturer, Fiona Bowie, who became my PhD supervisor, and she has worked with an anthropologist called Edith Turner, who was the wife.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly, the wife of Victor Turner, who's a very famous anthropologist who gives us these ideas about liminality and all of that kind of stuff, and ritual. And anyway, Edith Turner had these sort of powerful paranormal experiences, and she'd written about them in the early 90s, 1992. And when we were studying anthropology of religion, Fiona Bowie would, she would use Edith Turner, and she told us about this experience that she'd had, that Edith Turner had had, in one of our classes. And that was when I realized then that there's even a way to bring the paranormal right into the very heart of anthropology. And that's what basically triggered me off into doing my PhD. So I was like, well, what can I do, or what can I research that's going to allow me to really engage with the paranormal kind of on its own terms, through the lens of anthropology. And so that's when I found the Bristol Spirit Lodge. I actually started to research them for my undergraduate dissertation.
Okay.
So that was 2008, 2009. And so I found this group. I started off going to spiritualist churches for a little while to try to find people in Bristol who might be interested to have conversations with an interview. But I wasn't able to sort of establish that kind of relationship for whatever reason. I think I was quite shy as well. But then I went home and did some research online to try and find more sort of smaller groups, more intimate groups where it'd be easier to, interact and things. And I found this group, the Bristol Spirit Lodge, who were literally just 10, 15-minute walk, literally down the road from where I was living. So it was very, very convenient, but a completely different world. So I would leave my student accommodation and, walk down the road, get to this house. It was suburban Bristol. It was really sort of neat and tidy and things like that. And I knocked on the door. The door, it just looked like a normal sort of house. And there was a little sticker on the window that said Bristol Spirit Lodge on it. And that was the only thing that indicated it. And I went in and I met Christine, who is the founder of the circle. And we sat down and had a chat, and I told her that I was an anthropologist and I was interested in, studying the group, but not in the sense of trying to prove or disprove anything, but just to sort of, talk to people about their experiences and that kind of thing.
So that's quite standard with social science, isn't it? So I think it's called the phenomenological cut. You try and understand experiences on their own rather than try to find an explanation or ask the big questions.
Yeah, it's true, but I'll get onto that later.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there is this phenomenological cut, or bracketing it's called, but I think that it's problematic in lots of ways. But we'll see why, because when I first discovered this idea of a bracketing or cutting out the question of whether things are real or not, I thought it was a really liberating approach, and it was great, and it is great, especially when you're starting out thinking about these kinds of things, because you don't have to worry about whether it's real, and you can just look at the beliefs and how people respond to those beliefs and how it impacts their behavior and that kind of thing, which is all totally fine from a social scientific perspective. It's all just social stuff. But when you start to bring in the possibility that, mediumship isn't, or as we might say, mediumship isn't just about these social functions, but there's actually an experience going on there. And then you have to ask what's the nature of the experience. Then you have to confront the ontological question. And I had to confront that straight away, really, in the very first seance that I went to. There's a similar kind of a trend that I noticed with these experiences. Like with the mushroom experience, I never had a fairy experience again. It was just the first experience and it trailed off. And the same with the mediumship stuff. When I started to engage with the group at the very beginning, it was really intense. The first seance I went to, I saw this green face appearing over the medium. And I kept it to myself because I didn't want to make it seem like I was someone who has extraordinary experiences all the time, because I don't generally. Yeah, so yeah, in the very first seance I went to, I saw this green face, and I kept it to myself. But when we went out into the house after the seance to talk about things, someone else independently said, "Did anyone else see the green face?" And I had no choice then but to say that I'd seen it, and that raised all of these interesting questions, because I could have sworn that it was a hallucination. It had, like I say before, the qualities of something that wasn't physically there. It felt like a projection or something, but at the same time, other people seem to independently see it. So that automatically raises this problem with this bracketing approach. Because what are you going to do? How do you account for that without entertaining the possibility, at the very least, the possibility of there being some kind of real paranormal thing going on? So yeah, from the very first seance, it was like that. It was quite intense. It also kind of followed me home as well in the early days, and I had lots of intense sort of hypnagogic and hypnopompic kind of experiences. Again, with green things, fluorescent kind of green goat's head was one thing that I saw when I was lying in my bed, and it was rotating so it was really detailed. I have no idea what it relates to or means or anything, but all of these things just happened around this kind of time. So it was real intensity. And then over the years, so I ended up researching the group for about 7 years. It trailed off, and by the end of it, I was kind of bored of seances and that kind of thing. So
yeah,
it becomes just normal, and the communications and things from spirits are not as intense or interesting anymore. And I guess it's just the same as with most things in life, really. But there was definitely this decline effect with the experiences. So yeah, well, that's how I found out about this group and got involved with them.
I mean, that sort of decline seems to be common reports. I mean, there's some experimental that it happens with experiments, but also, in terms of things like poltergeist experiences, that the earliest phenomena quite often, well, there might be a peak, and then there's suddenly this tail off, which might be quite long, but it does seem to be time bound in some way that we can't understand. So when you found yourself confronting these questions, and then again, you go back to sort of the academy, and there's a lot of, well, the talk is, I think you refer them to as reductionist explanations. So could you explain a bit what reductionist explanations are, and why you think they might not be quite enough to cover what you were seeing?
Yeah, exactly. In anthropology, although it's a social science, it's a human sciences really. But like psychology, it tries to really want to fit into basically the same model as physics and chemistry and all of that kind of stuff, and biology. It wants to be hard science, and it wants to be grounded in that. So the standard explanations that come out of anthropological theory and stuff fit in with that dominant model. They almost from the beginning, they don't have to think about it. They just know they're going to fit in, because they don't want to challenge that. So you end up with things like explaining it purely in terms of social functions, for example. There's nothing wrong with social functions. It doesn't contradict any kind of physical laws or anything. And then you can say that, well, we can just study the social stuff. That's a reductionist explanation in some way, because you're ruling out any of the other kinds of things that there might be, like real spirits, for example, or real psi or whatever. So it reduces it down to a social function. And I'm not trying to say that there is no social function, because there absolutely is. These things do perform social functions, but that's not all there is. Another reductionist explanation is like psychopathological explanations, where basically it's all to do with something that's gone wrong in the brain, or it's illness. There were lots of anthropological theories of spirit possession. One really interesting one that said it was all to do with nutrient deficiency. And that's how you could explain spirit possession. But, it's quick to see that Western mediums are not necessarily subject to nutrient deficiency in the same way that, say, someone in sub-Saharan Africa might be. So that kind of explanation doesn't really work. And then there's all sorts of attempts to reduce it down to dissociative identity disorders or schizophrenia or various different kinds of things. But again, when you look into it, mediums often live healthy, normal everyday lives. They're not impacted negatively by their experiences and stuff like that. So all of the standard explanations, they make sense and they work up to a certain extent, but then they start to crumble, when faced with the real world, which is obviously much more fluid and dynamic. And people just like real people don't necessarily fit into those neat categories. You can't say that this person, this medium who's having extraordinary experiences is a schizophrenic or suffering from dissociative identity disorder, because they are, functioning normally and all of these kinds of things. So what I wanted to do was try to find a way of talking about this kind of stuff in the context of anthropology that doesn't try to reduce it down to any of those kind of things. And I'm not the only person who's ever suggested that. You can go right back to the 1800s and people like Andrew Lang, who was he was a president of the SPR and stuff, and he was also a folklorist and anthropologist, and he was saying the evidence from psychical research needs to be incorporated into anthropology, because if we want to understand religion and spirituality and these kinds of things, this is a fundamental part of it. Edith Turner, again, when she had her experience of seeing this grey, she saw like an ectoplasmic kind of blob, really, pulled out the back of someone during a healing ritual. She said that if we really want to understand rituals, like these kind of healing rituals and things, then we need to learn to see, she said, like see the way the natives see, to enter into another way of seeing the world, which I think then comes back to this consciousness thing.
Yes, definitely. It's funny because yesterday I was reading in the Skeptic magazine some of their articles on haunting experiences and other things. And from the skeptical point of view, some of the articles are very insightful, they're very interesting, and they've got novel angles on various things, but they rely entirely on that sort of social construction, or the sort of cognitive errors, hallucinations. But underlying this, I think, you really get the sense after reading several of the articles in a row, there is this absolute total rejection of any possibility of magic, paranormal, and certainly religion. And it's like, I think I remember reading a paragraph saying, well, we know ghosts don't exist. We're setting out to prove that they don't exist. And I remember thinking that's a very strange thing to devote your life to. I'm very interested in the world. I'm very curious. It's what got me into science, but it's also what got me into the sort of parascience as well. And it never occurred to me that I wanted to go out and disprove something, and why that was a priority.
Yeah. It's strange, isn't it?
But do you think that happens in mainstream consciousness studies? Because I mean, we're teaching on an approach consciousness course, which is a very sort of diverse and pluralistic. But there is definitely that current that wants to use reductionist explanations of consciousness, isn't there? And it tries very hard to be dominant, particularly through neuroscience. So what are your thoughts on the current state of play of consciousness studies, having been doing this course?
I was going to say, that I think that it's in consciousness studies as a field, if it is a single field, is in a bit of a pre-paradigmatic place, because there is so many different explanations. I do also think, though, that the idea that we should have one paradigm to explain everything is reductionist. Again.
Yes.
And I think the fact that we've got so many different models of consciousness and explanations for different theories is telling us something interesting about consciousness itself, which is that it isn't a single thing. That actually consciousness comes in many different forms. There might be some sort of like a scale of perception, for example, awareness and things like that. And also that consciousness, it kind of shifts and moves, and it can adapt to different kinds of conditions, I think. And so, one theory or one explanation of consciousness might focus on one aspect of it, like perception or something, and come up with a really good model and explanation for that, which might be correct. But again, like with the mediumship and stuff, it's only one part of something that is much bigger and more complex. And I think that with our theorizing and especially the way that we kind of popularize ideas about stuff, we have a tendency to think that the theory that I come up with, or the theory that whoever it is that comes up with the idea, is the theory, and they push it as the dominant explanation, when actually, like with all these other things, it's only a partial thing. It's an aspect of consciousness maybe that they're focusing in on rather than the bigger picture. So I think we need really lots and lots of theories of consciousness, and also not just from Western scientific and philosophical traditions, but also bringing in, all of the wealth of indigenous perspectives on consciousness and that kind of thing as well. And also, of course, the insights from like you're saying, the parasciences, the psychical research and parapsychology and stuff like that, all needs to be in this big conversation that's going to go on. Because I do think ultimately, probably, that there is a sort of reflexive issue with consciousness trying to understand itself, and we will need many different points of view and perspectives to make sense of that. We'll never get a complete picture of it, but we can learn about different aspects of it by looking at it in different kinds of ways. So that's I think that consciousness studies is trying to crystallize itself and to establish a paradigm for itself, or at least some aspects of consciousness studies is. But actually, maybe that's the wrong direction to be trying to head in. And we should, instead of trying to find one single explanation, be looking to as many different perspectives on consciousness as we can, and putting them into dialogue with each other. It's kind of what we do on our module, which is nice.
Yes. I mean, I think what's happening a little bit is this attempt to model consciousness studies after the natural sciences. So one of the talks by Anil Seth, who's a leading proponent of sort of very mainstream materialist, explicitly says that what we want to do is we understand life now in mechanistic terms, is essentially what he says. But what we want to do is understand the consciousness in mechanistic terms, so it's no longer mysterious. And again, I thought that's I think it's a feature of this modernist idea that there is a single truth out there, that we can understand it through the methods developed for the natural sciences. And once that happens, everything else becomes irrelevant or obsolete. And I think that's it. What you're saying is in a way, it's perhaps postmodern or beyond that. It's sort of ranged against that particular very sort of monistic view of what we should be doing in consciousness studies.
Yeah, it is. It's non-reductionist. Well, I think of myself as a non-reductionist. But that means that, any kind of thinking about these kind of things that I do, it just sort of keeps going and it expands out. And I think that's why, when I started to do mediumship research, what I was interested in was, because parapsychologists are just focused on mediums kind of like as individuals in a laboratory. So that's quite reductionist. So then what I was interested in was then, what are the social and cultural influences on the medium, and how does all of that come into it? What are the social dynamics within a group? So it extends the context outwards. And then more recently, I've been thinking about the ecological context, because societies and cultures and things are embedded within wider ecological systems again. So the perspective keeps building, and different kinds of elements add in, because it's not trying to reduce it down to understand it like maybe in a laboratory, but to try to understand it in the context of the actual world.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, we'll come on to the ecological stuff in a second, but could you, in your work, you use the words ontological flooding, which they're good words, but I think they need a bit of explanation. So can you they're related to what you've been saying, I think. So could you explain what ontological flooding is?
Yeah. So, well, ontology, first of all, is, in terms of philosophy, ontos is like being. So ontology is the study of existence, or the things that exist. And then there are ontologies, which are models, different models of what exists. And anthropology has realized that, there are many ontologies. There are lots of different ways of thinking about the world. Some people have a world that includes spirits, for example, and other people have a world that completely denies the existence of spirits. But all of these ontologies kind of coexist with each other. So they sometimes they interact with each other. Sometimes they lead to sort of fights and problems and stuff. Anyway, so there are many worlds in that way. So again, this doesn't have to be taken in the sense of implying that these other worlds really exist physically. We could just think about it in terms of cultures, that they are just models of the world, and there are lots of different models. But I think, again, in some way these worlds are actually real. But anyway,
it depends what you mean by real, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. That's a big question. But these other worlds are there anyway, whether they are actual or whether they are just models and different sort of theories about the world. So there are lots of ways of looking at it. The idea with ontological flooding is that if we really want to understand the world, like I was saying before, we have to have all of these different ontological models, because like I said, they're all looking at different aspects of it, and they may all be right or correct in some ways, giving us if we took them all together, we'd get a sort of a more nuanced idea about what is real. And it comes from, like I was saying before, this idea of bracketing in the social sciences, where you put up brackets around the issue and you say, well, we're not going to ask whether it's real or not. We'll bracket out all of that stuff and just focus on the social and the cultural. And I was saying we need to get rid of those brackets completely and let all of these possibilities flood in. So that we have like a deluge of different possibilities about what might be going on. And then even if we don't come to a definitive conclusion, we still have a nuanced kind of understanding. So with mediumship, for example, the bracketed approach, like I was saying, is to put the brackets around and say, well, it's just social. The ontologically flooded approach is to say, well, there's these biological things that are going on in the brain. There are changes that you could observe with the neuroelectrical things. There are social functions going on. There's cultural influences going on. There's possible psi influences involved in there, because there's evidence for the existence of psi. There's the possibility of spirits, because there's also possible evidence for spirits, and so on. So it just keeps expanding. And then you realize that something like mediumship, or even anything that we do, is not a simple thing. It's a culmination of lots of different processes. And any kind of attempt to understand that by just focusing in on one aspect of it is going to be limited, because there are many aspects.
Do you think it can trivialize the experience as well? Because I think that's what I've noticed, that I've had a range of quite strange experiences, and I've spoken to a lot of witnesses at this point, and I've noticed that a lot of the sort of these social science or neuroscience, they're useful theories to have. Yeah. And absolutely, I think they feed into an understanding of what's going on. But I think quite often for the witness, I don't think the witnesses are often looking for complete vindication or whatever, but I think they're looking to be heard. And I think sometimes what happens, particularly in abstract academic debates, is the debates get very abstract, and they get involved in the theory, and the qualitative side of what the witness is saying is often put to the wayside. And I've noticed that particularly in the debates over psychedelics. So, there's a lot of brilliant studies coming out at the moment showing exactly what's going on in the brain when you take psilocybin or DMT. But quite often in those papers, there's hardly any reference to what the witnesses are actually saying, or at the most, very superficial, if they think they can explain it in terms of the brain function.
Yeah, there is. I think the qualitative element of it needs to be brought to the front, really. that there is, like you said, disconnect between the kind of reductive explanations and then the complexity and the kind of impact of the experience on people's lives, which is, it's profound in all sorts of different ways beyond just biological changes. It changes the way that people go on to live their lives, and who they interact with, and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's way more complex, I think, than any of these reductive models really want to allow for. But that's because they're trying to fit it into, a laboratory model kind of way of doing science, and they can't incorporate all of this stuff in the same way that maybe anthropology can, because it's about thinking about people in the world, observing people.
I mean, that is understandable. If you're trying to do an experiment, then you're going to have to focus on some things and leave the others. And I think that's not a problem. I find a lot of the brain studies and cognitive studies very interesting, and they do give additional insights to what's going on. I think quite often, again, where I start to part company is this story that knows what's real, that knows what's to reject. And I think at this point, it's probably good to move over to the ecological dimension of this, because I think when we were chatting before this, there was a quote in one of your writings suggesting that the same sort of cultural worldview and sort of attitude that is behind the denial of sort of strange and paranormal experience is also implicated in ecological destruction. And I think that's really important. That's certainly becoming an essential theme in my writings. And I just wonder, could you explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, in one way, it's quite straightforward, because it's sort of science and technology that has in many ways driven, with the Industrial Revolution and all of this kind of stuff. There's that element of it that, it hasn't necessarily all been good, and there's been a lot of sort of negative consequences of our scientific and technological stuff. And that's been driven by a model of the self, of what the person is, which is also incorporates into this, that we're an individual, that we're bounded off from the rest of ourselves. And it's also from other people, we're an individual, isolated entity. And this is also associated with, capitalism and all of that kind of stuff, which is all about the individual again, and just basically accumulating as much wealth as you can for individual needs. So I think that there's that element of it, that, they're bound up in this individualistic philosophy that's very anthropocentric. It's all about humans and human well-being and stuff like that, human flourishing, and then a lack of consideration for the possibility of other kinds of entities out there, non-human things. So yeah, there's that aspect of it. But I also think there's a slightly kind of deeper angle on it as well, where the scientific worldview is kind of this personal aspect of it that has been denied. So with the paranormal, for instance, there's a denial of the possibility of external spirits, and even the reductionist explanations are that we project it out, or that it's a result of cognitive errors or whatever it is. So it denies the existence of the non-human a lot, to a certain extent anyway. And it's only relatively recently, 2012, I think, that there was a Cambridge Declaration on animal sentience.
Yes.
So, took us a long time to come to that point. So maybe things are going to change gradually. But this is the big difference. There's the animistic worldview that sees the world as alive and full of personhood and spirits of different kinds of beings that exist in the world that we have to live in a good relationship with. And then the scientific or technological kind of extractive worldview, which denies the existence of animal consciousness even, or has tried to for a very long time. When we get into thinking about trees, for example, chopping down trees and stuff, the technological, capitalist, individualistic way of looking at them is to see them as resources and natural resources. The animistic paranormal, spiritual way of seeing trees is as, living entities. So there's a big disconnect between those two worlds. And there was a historian called Lynn White Jr. He wrote a very famous paper in 1963 about the historical roots of the ecological crisis. And he suggested that it was a spiritual shift that occurred that changed the way that human beings, in the Western world anyway, look at the world around them. And he said it was the shift towards the individualism of Christianity and away from what he called pagan animism, that was the main kind of drive for the ecological crisis that we're in today. When we stopped seeing the world as alive and as persons to be engaged with and lived with in relationship, and started to see it as resources for human needs, human flourishing, that we laid the foundations for the technological and scientific stuff that came after that saw the world as dead, basically, and ready to be used by us. So I think that in that way, it's the rejection of, within sort of mainstream materialist science, of the possibility of personhood in the world beyond the human, is linked to both the rejection of the paranormal and the ecological crisis. And, so you could imagine that if we lived in a culture or society that embraced the possibility, at the very least, that the world is alive, then we would, engage with it on a very different kind of footing.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the sort of ideas about the sacred and the numinous, because if you think a forest is sacred, then you're less likely to cut it down. So what's implied in what you're saying is that if you move to an animistic point of view, then maybe these paranormal experiences are actually a natural part of, and perhaps inseparable part of that. Because I think one thing that interested me was that I started reading a lot of environmental works. Like there's the book, The Voice of the Earth, which is a founding text of eco-psychology. And halfway through there's a massive critique of scientific materialism for very similar reasons. I was finding a convergence between what I was reading in people who are trying to develop post-materialist views of consciousness, and then in the environmental writings, that it really did, as time goes on, it's become so clear to me that these are two sides of the same coin. But at the same time, in environmentalism, you've got a lot of people heavily, understandably, relying on the science. So, for example, for climate breakdown, we're heavily dependent on climate scientists to give us the latest, usually quite horrible details about what's going on. Do you think there's still a disconnect between sort of perhaps more mainstream environmental work and maybe the way it's presented as essentially it's a technical problem, isn't it, basically? And perhaps the deeper work that needs to be done to actually perhaps heal our culture and move forward.
Yeah, exactly. It's often thought of to be a scientific and technological issue. But, if we go back to like what Lynn White Jr. was saying, it's obviously also a cultural or maybe even spiritual problem as well. We know that religion, for example, has a real powerful effect on people's behavior. So the beliefs that people hold about the world really do have an impact on the way that we behave in the world. So you could imagine, it doesn't even have to be a religion. It could just be ideas that are prevalent in the culture. But if the culture had within it ideas about a sentient planet, or at least a living planet, then again, we would behave in very different ways. So I think it is a fundamental kind of cultural issue rather than a purely scientific issue. But at the same time, you can't, extract science from culture either. It is a part of culture and is actually a culture itself.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. All cultures, some sociologists of science have talked about different cultures in different disciplines. So, I think this is another problem, actually. We talk about science in a very unitary way, and I think that's actually very misleading. Mm-hmm. There are sciences, and they really form a tapestry of a very valuable knowledge. So I think this is the thing. It's and I like to emphasize this, that it's very much not about rejecting those approaches, which are very important, like the neuroscience, cognitive science, but it is about it. I think it's necessary to expand. But I think what I point to is, for me, increasingly that sort of very anti-magic modernist approach, which seeks to basically remove anything that it doesn't like. I think it's, for me, becoming an anachronism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's suiting the age that we're living in, and I don't think it's suiting our needs anymore. And that's why I think we need to be looking at these weird experiences.
Yeah, exactly. And they these weird experiences, there's a real connection here as well, in the phenomenology, because there's all sorts of examples of people coming back from these experiences and actually being transformed in some way and going about their lives in very different ways. There's lots of interesting papers recently about the effects of psychedelic experiences on people and how they end up becoming more interested in environmental activism and gardening and all of this kind of stuff. The same goes for near-death experiences. Kenneth Ring noted it in his work, that they become more involved in community, level kind of activism and stuff like that. And also, John Mack talked about alien abductees and the same kind of thing going on there. So, people coming back from being abducted by aliens and they get shown images of the Earth being destroyed and all of that kind of stuff. And then they go about changing their way of life. Mm-hmm. So I think that, the paranormal, these kinds of experiences have got a proven, we could say maybe almost proven, capacity to change people. Jeff Kripal talks about the flip, doesn't he? This idea that we have these sort of ontological shifts that occur when we have these kinds of experiences. So I think it is a powerful kind of, I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to have a paranormal experience and then that will change the world, but maybe it would.
It's like Aldous Huxley in his fictional Island was talking about people taking psychedelics to heal themselves, but also become more connected to their community and the earth.
Yeah.
And, you could say that's quite a naive view, but that's a theme that, again, I know these themes recur over and over again. And I think possible to exaggerate it, but I get such a strong sense that these are important sort of inner resources and experiences that we can no longer afford to actually neglect.
Yeah.
They're actually important and they can't just be dismissed. So, I think that's an important shift. So we're coming up on the hour. So I'd like to ask you, what are you currently working on? And have you got any books you'd like to recommend?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, I say last year I released 3 books. So I'm having a bit of a chill out year this year. I did last year we had Deep Weird, which was an exploration of high strangeness in paranormal experiences. The book goes in different chapters from different authors exploring different aspects of high strangeness, really. I also published a book, Ecology and Spirituality, which is a fully authored book by me that is about, how ecology and spirituality intersect with each other. It goes in different directions. It brings in parapsychology, and I think it's an ontologically flooded introduction. And the other book was Folklore, People and Place, which I co-edited with Dr. Rachel Ironside, which is about tourism and folklore and how engaging with kind of local traditions can, in some cases, that's actually negative. That leads to ecological destruction. There's an example of in the Isles of Skye up in Scotland, of people going to the fairy glens and because it's a tourist attraction and trashing the place. But there are also examples of folklore being used in positive ways to promote sort of pro-environmental behaviors as well. So there were 3 books from last year. And then this year, I've got a book coming out with Dr. Bernadette Brady from the Sophia Centre. It should be coming out in the autumn, about sacred geography. It's called Sacred Geography, Conversations with Place. And it's all student essays from our sacred geography module in the Sophia Centre, exploring different aspects of the sacred in different kinds of places. So there's all sorts of interesting stuff there, from holy mountains right the way through to sort of motorway underpass as sacred spaces.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then the book that I'm working on at the moment is going to be another written book. It's called, my title for it anyway, is Of Minds and Monsters. And it really is, what I want it to be is kind of like an introduction to consciousness studies and the main kinds of theories that we talk about, but then also to take sort of the implications further. So, for example, with panpsychism and other kinds of things like that, they really imply that there could be many different kinds of minds out there in the world, different forms, different ways that it might have evolved and developed in different kinds of niches. And that, when we realize that, then, all these strange encounters that we have described from like the 1970s, of strange, weird humanoids and stuff, which, we might at first want to just dismiss them outright because they're so strange. Yeah, when they're so strange and bizarre, you might want to just, throw them out and not think about them, just assume that they are delusional or whatever. But if we take something like panpsychism as a possibility, there is some element of possibility that these kinds of things could exist in some way. So that's what I want to think about, how there could be sort of even philosophical underpinnings to give some kind of credence to these kinds of entities. So it's going to be a weird book. It's going to be a mixture of high strangeness and consciousness studies.
Well, that sounds like it'll be very interesting. I think these are really valuable sort of fields. I think it's great to widen it out. It's between from that sort of quite narrow academic perspective, which again has its strengths. But I think the broader approach, the sort of more Fortean approach, if you like, is definitely very important too. And I think it's partly important exactly because it has been marginalised, so it's been left, as you've said, to amateur investigators and journalists to look at rather than academics. So, yeah, okay. Well, I wish you the best on that. This has been a really fascinating talk. I'm sure people will love it, and I'd love to have you on the podcast again at some point.
Love to come back.
What Lies Beyond with Matt Colborn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.